joining me today to look at this spaces. We're looking at Niyi Falade, the CEO of Crusader Sterling Pensions, is our guest host today. And also my colleague Wole Famurewa joins us from Atlanta, Georgia. Wole, thank you so much for joining us on the show. And let me start with Wole. And it looks like it's going to go down the wire. Can you share some feelers from where you are in Georgia?
Yes, good morning, Kenneth. Like as you mentioned, it does appear to be going down the wire, and it's certainly too early to call the outcome of these elections. But I think the big story that has really come through over the last 1 hour are some of the remarks we've heard from President Donald Trump, and I'd just like to highlight a couple of them. He's already suggesting that he has won the elections and that the Republican Party are poised for a legal challenge to protect that victory. And just to quote him, some of the points he made is that this is a fraud on the American public. He also mentioned that our goal now is to maintain the integrity of the election, want all voting to stop. Now, I think that's a key statement because, as you know, in this run, this time, we've seen an unprecedented number of mail-in ballots. And what I think many of the states are going through now is to simply count those ballots and to ensure that every vote counts. And that is the rhetoric that has also come from Vice President Joe Biden, who is, of course, the challenger in this contest. He made that point in an earlier remark, I think within the last 2 hours, suggesting that he still feels good about these elections, but he's waiting to ensure that he's fighting to ensure that every vote counts. And we'll see whether or not we can see some of those early advantages that we saw for President Trump, such as the case in the state of Georgia, where I'm at now. We have seen a trimming of that lead as more and more votes are counted. And Georgia is one of those states that many are suggesting that President Donald Trump cannot afford to win. He of course, won quite a few of the battleground states, Florida being one major victory for President Donald Trump, where we saw perhaps a much greater vote from the Latino electorate. So it's still a very close contest. We continue to watch it, but I do get the sense that in the next few hours, we'll begin to get a sense of where this is headed. However, I can't rule out the fact that we may still be on this, waiting for the outcome of these polls until much later in the day.
All right, now let me bring in Niyi Falade into this. Niyi, I'd like to get your thoughts on the development so far and the race to the 270 electoral college votes.
Well, thank you very much. I think what's happening now has been predicted somewhat. We have a situation where a lot of investors are taking position based on expected large sweep by the Democratic Party, otherwise called the blue wave. But certainly that hasn't happened. And what we've seen in the markets in the early hours of this morning is that the market seems to be reversing its earlier positions. As it is clear now that it's a tight race, and as we speak, it's just too close to call. I think what's important is the implication of win by either party on emerging markets, or perhaps Africa and Nigeria in particular. I think for me that is what is key. And there are key issues here. First one is around immigration. Obviously, we know what win by Trump means for immigration. I mean, refugees have been capped at 18,000. And Vice President Joe Biden has promised that that's going to be raised significantly. So again, that has implications for countries like Nigeria and Africa in general. The energy policy is another key one. Joe Biden is promising a net zero emissions by 2050. I think that's big. He's also promised $2 trillion on clean energy going forward. So he's obviously leading the clean energy revolution if he comes in, and that has implications on the oil industry. We know where Donald Trump stands on these issues. He doesn't believe anything carbon emission, and all his acts to date suggest it's also not going to change that policy. We also know the stance of these two contenders on Iran, which is also another major issue for the oil industry. President Joe Biden is promising to honor the international pact with Iran for the nuclear treaty that they have. And so clearly, if he wins, that means you may find that the sanctions that the US have imposed on Iran will be lifted. And the implication of that on the oil industry is that the market is going to now start having fresh supplies from Iran. We're talking about an already oversupplied market. So this is going to increase the glut, and then it has a negative implication on oil prices. So these are the key issues. Another one that must be spoken about is the trade policy. What's going to happen to China, if either party wins? We know where Donald Trump sits when it comes to trade policy. And why I'm talking about China is because for emerging market, China accounts for 42% of the Morgan Stanley index. And so, be that as it may, whatever stands against China is very, very important to passive investors in the emerging markets.
All right, now let me bring it back, Wole, into this conversation. And Wole, it looks like we might see that wait being a bit longer when you look at the dynamics playing in states like Pennsylvania. And also, I'd like to get your thoughts as well on the swing states.
Well, many had thought that these elections will be won in those battleground states, as you mentioned. But as I mentioned earlier, it will be interesting to see the outcome of the polls in the state of Georgia, for example, which we know for the last several election cycles have gone the way of the Republicans. Now, President Donald Trump is leading in the race so far, and with I think well over 90% of the votes counted already, he still is in pole position. But as more and more votes have been counted, we've seen that advantage narrow. So we wait to see the outcome of that. But you mentioned Pennsylvania, and I think to a large extent, we might be talking a lot about Pennsylvania. That seems to be the focus of potentially a lot of litigation around these elections. Many controversial statements have been made around the polls in Pennsylvania. Of course, President Donald Trump, in his address in the last hour, also pointing to Pennsylvania as potentially a spot where he thinks there could be some voting malpractice. The Attorney General of the state also in a controversial statement suggesting that President Trump is unlikely to win the polls, and many had called him out on that statement. So it will be interesting to see how things play out, but what we're watching very closely now over the next few hours is what happens in states like Wisconsin, Michigan. As some of those results are announced, it becomes clearer and clearer whether or not this remains a tight contest and a winner would emerge in the next few hours.
All right, but Mr. Falade, very quickly, though, I'd just like to get your best and worst case scenarios.
I think the best case is a Biden win. We already know what Trump wins suggests or portends for everybody. And that, for me, is his stance on trade policy. If Biden wins, I think that portends growth, significant trade growth, across the world, which is what bodes well for emerging market. Because that would then lead to weaker dollar. What emerging market investors are looking for is a weaker dollar compared to what we have now under Trump, where dollar is very strong. So for me, that's the best case. Of course, worst case is if Donald Trump comes back.